What if PDA Profile of Autism Advocates are confusing non-autism features with autism by Richard Woods at London Southbank University, PhD student. So this is a post hoc recording of a talk I did at the 2023 Autscape conference on the topic of if non-autism features are being confused with autism due to assuming PDA is a profile of ASD or autism spectrum disorder. I'm just going to quickly on a conflict of interest. So I'm developing various PDA tools. I do gain some income from delivering PDA training sessions, and I reluctantly advocate for PDA to be diagnosed as a standalone construct. So about my own kind of perspective and background, so you can get an idea of my biases coming into the talk. So I am diagnosed as autistic in 2012. I meet Elizabeth Neeson's PDA profile, but I am not emotionally attached to it. I presently am no longer basing my identity on diagnostic categories because I think they're just pretty naff. But I don't think they're poor at what they're meant to do, basically, incredibly poor at what they're meant to do. I instead favour a transdiagnostic approach, and we should be aspiring to stop utilising disorder-based constructs. My agenda is for at least inclusive, good quality, scientific method-based research and practice, and I'm doing a PhD in investigating PDA as part of the Critical Autism Studies / Disability Studies group at London Southbank University, and this is my interpretation of the PDA literature. Others may disagree. So, yeah. Quick introduction. So, what the talk covers. So, a few models of PDA. Just recognising PDA's controversial status. Give an example of typical research standards. Reasons to consider if non-autism features are being confused in PDA, and then just kind of talking about briefly PDA and autism subtypes literature. Then talking about fallacies in the kind of PDA profile of ASD discourse, and then just summing up. So, yes. So if you consider the kind of claims that the autism spectrum has expanded to include PDA as a profile of autism, it basically says that the features of PDA represent as a series of continua within the autistic population. So you would have features like anxiety, avoidance of auditory demands, like bullying, harassment, lying, stalking, etc., through the way down to kind of through mind issues which are meant to be seen in autism. So please don't write this diagram. There's some problematic aspects with it. I'm just going from the PDA literature, and so what the arrows show is that if it's red, it's basically meant to be impaired, and green is meant to be less problematic or not a problem. So on the left-hand side, you have PDA profile of autism, and on the right-hand side, you have kind of classical, more straightforward autism that's referred to in PDA literature. I put down how you might else also interpret them. So like just autism down on the right, and or a bunch of co-occurring difficulties like anxiety, ADHD, conduct disorder, and like trauma features on the left, instead of PDA profile of ASD, which is kind of gets the gist of where I'm going with this talk. So moving on, you can take different aspects of PDA descriptions and attribute them to accepted kind of difficulties or categories. So you could argue that PDA is represented by exclusionary features from anxiety, kind of trauma, oppositional defiant disorder, and kind of ADHD, and some kind of disorder stuff there. So where they all intersect, it's a kind of variation. You kind of get PDA here. So it's kind of important because most people who are diagnosed with a diagnostic category from the main American Diagnostic Manual, they will have two or more such categories, and we know that these categories often unpredictably interact with each other. So what that means is that some features may be more intense, others may be less intense, but they might also interact to create novel features which can be more intense or more problematic than the original categories. And this can create kind of new categories by itself. It's also an issue because we know that generally that co-occurring difficulties often present differently in autistic people versus non-autistic people. what this means is that PDA may be the result of things like anxiety, ADHD, or oppositional defiant disorder, and or kind of trauma in any kind of combination interacting and predicted to produce PDA profile of ASD. What it also means is that PDA likely presents differently in non-autistic persons. So what that means is if you're basing PDA descriptions on assuming it's a certain form of autism or a profile of ASD, for example, or basing your clinical descriptions on suspected autistic populations, these descriptions of PDA are unlikely to be representative of PDA in non-autistic populations. So what that means is that you can't use descriptions which assume PDA is either autism or based on suspected autistic populations to say how PDA presents in non-autistic populations. So going back to it, so this is the previous diagram I've seen. So what I'm just going to restate what I said. So it is possible that any combination of things like anxiety, trauma, developmental trauma, kind of like ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, or conduct disorder can interact to produce what is being called PDA profile of autism, which is kind of on the right side of the keys. You can kind of see like the atypical social interactors, which some people think PDA has, so like the hyperactivity, social behaviours, fantasy role play, conduct problems, etc., etc. Autism is noted down at the bottom here, like social communication issues and RRBIs and etc. from the DSM-5 autism criteria. So moving on, typically how PDA has been approached in the UK. So it's mainly been researched from PDA Profile of ASD, advocating researchers' kind of understandings of autism. We know that caregivers are often highly motivated to take part in research. We know that interest in the UK is largely centred in the UK, and that is a culture-bound concept to the UK. And we know that interest over the last 10 years has rocketed into PDA as a form of autism, and that interest significantly outstrips the evidence base. And these are quotes mainly from PDA Profile of Autism advocating researchers. So it isn't stuff that I'm making up. I would also point out that due to campaigning efforts, persons can be on the lookout for PDA and its potential source of bias, and this includes PDA Profile of ASD advocating kind of clinicians and researchers. The literature acknowledges that PDA is controversial, and there's been several reviews of the PDA evidence base over the last 3 years, and they've all concluded there's little to no good quality evidence to suggest what PDA is or what features are associated with it, and divergent opinion has been treated equally. So, this is parties like the Royal College of Psychiatry, the British Psychological Society. That's a systematic review. That's a Dutch systematic review, and that's NICE, which is I forgot what it's called. Something like the National Institute for Clinical Excellence or Clinical and Health Excellence. And PDA has been consistently challenged for over 2 decades since it's been law on a wing in 2002. So there should be a lot of there's good reasons to be cautious about what's being claimed about PDA. So what that means is that especially when you consider autism history, there are old and kind of more recent examples of bold claims being made, which often can have perverse ramifications, perverse and adverse ramifications. Some of this is partly due to autism having systemically poor quality theory research and practice. We're going to go mention some recent examples. So we're talking about examples of refrigerator mother vaccines causing autism, like theory of mind deficits, empathy deficits, and extreme male brain theory. It's a bit awkward that the latter theory are mainly associated with one highly prominent clinician / researcher. But what this means is that autism stakeholders, either the advocates or researchers or autistic people themselves, we have very good reasons to adhere to typical ethical standards. I'm going to give an example. So I'm a co-author on the Monotropism questionnaire initial validation study, and we as researchers have a responsibility to minimise and avoid causing harm to just anyone, that includes our participants, but also to the general public. We know that there's significant interest within the autistic population, autistic community, and the neurodiverse community in monotropism theory. For example, we had over 700 autistics in our initial validation study from snowball sampling, and that's like a stupidly good figure, basically. So yeah. So this is an example of a couple of recent TikTok videos that have gained quite a significant amount of interest. So the top one's got 2.7 million views, and the bottom one has 564,000 views. So this was nice, and I do appreciate the interest, no pun intended, in monotropism. It has been a bit of an issue because it's gone viral as a autism self-assessment test, which it's not. The MQ itself assesses a version of monotropism, not autism itself. In the future, it might be that a monotropism questionnaire or versions of it are validated as a autism assessment tool, but the present one is not. The reasons for this is that the monotropism questionnaire itself may not, the current version of it may not be representative of non-white autistics experiences. And yeah, we also do not know if monotropism cognitive style is only seen in autistic people. So it's just too early to say that it is an autism assessment tool, although the data suggests that it can be quite good at detecting autistic people, but that's a tangent. So what this means is that a few of the co-authors have acted swiftly to prevent potential erroneous verification of the Monotropism questionnaire as an autism self-assessment tool. So we come out quite quickly going that it's not an autism self-assessment test, it assesses a version of monotropism. And I'm saying that because the present MQ is based significantly based on our monotropism work, and there's some slight disagreements among monotropism experts over how exactly monotropism presents, etc. So yeah, so what this action tells us is that I and my co-authors have made a decision to challenge this potential reification of the MQ as an autism self-assessment test, because we're trying to avoid any harm being done by that, and that's because we have no difficulty to do that. What that means is if you can apply it to PDA Profile of ASD, where there is similar kind of hype and interest from many thousands of vulnerable people, that PDA is a profile of autism, is that it indicates that the responsibility for potential harm from reifying PDA as a profile of autism is for those advocating PDA as a profile of autism, is that those who are claiming that PDA is a profile of autism, they should be taking responsibility for what they're saying about PDA and being much more cautious about the claims they're making. And they should be doing that to prevent any potential harm being done. So I'm moving on to why it's reasonable to consider if non-autism features are being confused with autism in PDA. So the first point is that Elizabeth Newson herself has questioned if at least one aspect of her PDA descriptions were due to not due to PDA. So this is a screenshot from her 1996 conference talk that she did in Durham, which is kind of listening to kind of I think her study B from a 2003 article. So this is from page 20, and he's talking about fitting behaviours in her 50 cases. 50 cases that she did in a study B of hers. And she just asks, is this behaviour due to the inattentive subtype of ADHD? And this was 27 years. This is going on for like 30 years ago when Newton asked this. So more recently, so since then, when Newton's work was published, like Eleanor Geralda kind of responded to Newton's article saying that her studies indicate that her 150 cases of PDA might have co-occurring difficulties such as ADHD anxiety disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. More recently, kind of like in 2011, Lorna Wing co-authored an article with Christopher Yorberg and Judy Gold saying that PDA might be a double hit, so that the behaviours of PDA may not be caused by autism, so they might, for example, be caused by psychopathic tendencies instead of autism. Also, since then, like Green et al. In 2018 questioned how I do co-occurring difficulties like ADHD, that social anxiety disorder, and optional defiance to describe the component features of PDA. I'd also point out since then, like NICE has recognised that many topic experts question if PDA is a distinct category, and that its features can be better described by kind of accepted kind of difficulties and stuff. So there is active debate, and this outlook is actively kind of being discussed within the PDA literature. It's something that should be kind of more widely acknowledged. There is some empirical evidence to kind of support that. Obviously, most of this evidence is going to be poor quality, or going to have a high risk of bias. But so these are just some examples. So Elizabeth Nyons in 2014, one of the first empirical studies suggests that PDA was a triple hit of autism, conduct problems, and anxiety. It's assumed anxiety because the actual scale or subscale that the test it used doesn't actually assess anxiety. So also since then, like in a Jonathan Green et al. 2018 A paper, there was a study based on clinical referrals to a clinic run by Michael Absood, which suggested that PDA features are predicted by anxiety, conduct problems, and hyperactivity. And another example is with adults. It's from Egan et al. 2020, which is that PDA features are predicted by attention issues, antagonism, and emotional instability. And these were more strongly predicted than autism predicted PDA features. So more recently, there was like a study done with children over 12 months, which looked at how psychiatric co-occurring difficulties may affect adaptive behaviour, and they found that PDA was not discriminating while kind of present assessment categories do. So they noted that these results are in agreement with authors who question the validity of PDA's entity, and they specifically reference Green et al. 2018A. I'd point out that if research is indicating that PDA is representing multiple different difficulties and multiple different categories, basic logic tells you that PDA cannot be something that it is more than. So this is like basic logic. So like A plus B plus C does not equal A. So if PDA represents something that's more than autism or more than ADHD, it can't really be a form of either. So this is a screenshot of a table I had published in a book chapter about 7 months ago. If features represent, these are example items from various PDA tools, various open access PDA tools. So these questions indicate that PDA behaviours are often done deliberately with intent. So if you actually read them, a lot of these features are not indicative of autism. So it's just like, does A ever threaten to hurt himself, him or herself, do things to hurt him or herself? Is this behaviour impulsive? Is it done on purpose? Is he or she's in control, cause distress, or get attention? Did they lie, cheat, steal, fantasizes, cause distress to others? Did they do social shocking behaviour with intent? Do they frequently tease, bully, refuse to take turns, make trouble? And it's just, the point is that the PDA itself, many of its features are not indicative of autism, and this kind of gives a big warning sign if you actually stop and consider this, that it is likely that, or at least certainly it's plausible, that non-autistic features are being confused with autism due to assuming PDA is a profile of autism. So it's also been noted by Alan Geralda that back in 2003, literally like 20 years ago, that PDA will create confusion for caregivers as involved, which includes clinicians. So just if you're diagnosing PDA, it will create confusion. And the risk to clinical language validity and turning those logic upside down, and PDA being a recipe for clinical and research confusion was acknowledged in Green et al. 2018b. So other kind of point to consider is there is a general failure to take into account for alternative explanations for PDA behaviours, and that some participants from places knowledgeable in PDA Profile of Autism is a risk of bias, and this is from one of the systematic reviews. There's a clear risk that non-autistic features could be confused with autism due to assuming PDA is a profile of ASD, and this is, from my perspective, like this risk should already be actively being considered. I should not need to do a conference talk talking about it, because basically those advocating for PDA as a profile of autism should already be kind of actively considering it and taking steps to go about it instead of just assuming that they know better than everyone else. So yeah, it's also kind of important to know kind of historical context going through today is that historically PDA has been assumed to be a distinct and separate cluster of features compared to autism. So Newson was quite clear that she considered PDA to be separate from autism, but related. So it's meant to be different, and she also said it had to be distinctly different from autism, specifically two subtypes of Asperger's and autistic disorder, but she meant autism at the time. More recently, kind of PDA Profile of Autism advocating kind of clinicians and kind of organisations are kind of taking this in a review. So they're saying that, like, this is from a chapter by Ruth Fidder. So there's growing acknowledgement that individuals with PDA have a recognisable pattern of characteristics that are similar to each other and distinct from those others with more straightforward presentation of autism. I really just like that term, more straightforward, from that's being used. But that's a tangent. This is from PDA Society. So this is from what the PDA Society claims to be clinical guidance. I just think it's a highly biased research report. So PDA is currently best understood as a profile or cluster of traits on the autism spectrum. So this is meant to be a kind of cluster of features that's kind of separate from other people within it. They also this document also claims that PDA is being over-diagnosed, but the implication of that is that there's a bunch of non-proper PDA diagnoses, or that bunch of PDA diagnoses that do not conform to PDA profile or autism, which is what they mean by that. So we know this is a bit of an issue because if you compare PDA assessment thresholds in a actual PDA literature, they are different. So there's different, depending on the frequency, intensity, demand avoidance, they all correspond to a different number of people. So, for example, Eaton and Weaver, which the PDA Society's high bias research report seems to kind of build on, or takes as gospel, for example. That's based as the demand avoidance is kind of pervasive and only seen in autistic people. So Newson's kind of seen also outside of autistic people, and these ones are these have a much lower threshold. So these is kind of the demand avoidance only has to be kind of seen in kind of one setting for it to kind of pathologized. I've got a 9,000 word blog post explaining the rationale behind this diagram, because I thoroughly kind of went through the rationale for why I've got this diagram on there. So wide lines are where they are and how I kind of separate them out and stuff. So yeah, it's also quite important because what the PDA Profile of Autism advocates are trying to do is they're trying to separate out PDA diagnosis from proper PDA and kind of non-proper PDA, or what they might call rational demand avoidance. This is problematic because one, they basically appropriated irrational demand avoidance from Damien Milton and myself, and both I and Damien do not recognise this arbitrary difference between the two proposed categories by PDA Profile Autism supporters, which is like PDA Profile Autism and rational demand avoidance. The reason why I'm mentioning this diagram is because it's exactly kind of similar thing which profound autism proponents are trying to do. So profound autism is another proposed autism subgroup, and it's also based on using co-occurring difficulties to create the subgroups. So it's based in for autistic people who have intellectual disability and or language impairment, who are meant to have 24-hour support needs. But the problem with profound autism is, in relation to this critique of PDA Profile of Autism, is that profound autism advocates are saying that non-profound autism advocates are basically not disabled. They're not impaired compared to profound autism, autistic people. And it's the exact same kind of connotation attached to kind of PDA profile of autism versus kind of their rational demand avoidance. And I need to be stressed is that both these distinctions between kind of profound autism and non-profound autism and kind of PDA profile of ASD and kind of non-PDA profile of ASD autistic people, those two kind of distinctions are completely arbitrary and are quite highly problematic. So yeah, I'm just going to quickly explain this diagram. So it's got functioning, so kind of reverse support needs on one side, kind of DSLR for autism at the back, profound autism top left, bottom left, and PDA down the bottom. And I do quickly say, please do not reify it. It's a bit problematic if you do. So yeah, it's also a bit of an issue when you compare what's going on with profound autism advocates. So they are claiming that autistic reverse supporters are harassing them. Likewise, that non-autistic, non-disabled autistic persons cannot advocate for those with profound autism. So for example, I've had a PDA cited claim that I've harassed them, which I think is a nonsense. I think they should be taking responsibility for what they're actually doing. But also, in terms of PDA Profile of ASD advocates, I've had them claim that my work on PDA is not representative of their lived experience and other bits and pieces, and I have great issues with this claim just because there is actual growing evidence to support my views on PDA. And there's also independent work kind of like just supporting my views on PDA. So, for example, the Monotropism questionnaire, that's based on my Monotropism developmental model, which I developed to explain PDA and autistic people. So my views on Monotropism actually has some support empirical evidence. It's probably poor quality support empirical evidence, but it does have some support. So the profound autism advocates are trying to argue for like ignoring non-disabled autistics kind of preferences and stuff, and they're also saying that like kind of other ableist terms like profound autism should be used. So this compares to kind of PDA profile autism advocates in terms of ignoring people's views like mine and Damien Milton in terms of like how rational demand avoidance should be used, or ignoring how most autistic people do not want autism to be divided into autism subgroups. So it's also trying to point out that like it should be quite clear that there's similar actions being taken by PDA profile autism advocates compared to profound autism advocates in terms of that PDA profile autism advocates are trying to prioritise their outlooks, and this is kind of showing throughout this talk and kind of elsewhere. And I give an example which Damien Milton gives in 2022 book chapter. I also showed in his book chapter of mine from 2022 that PDA clinical descriptors have changed to become autism-like. So the PDA literature acknowledges that PDA has many problematic aspects that do not conform to autism understandings. But if you compare them over time, they have changed to become more autism-like. So I give an example in terms of the social avoidance behaviours. They are noted to be manipulative, and manipulative behaviours are not indicative of autism. So if you see the original one by Newton is strategies of avoidance are essentially socially manipulative. This is then changed to strategies of avoidance that are essentially socially manipulative in kind of quotation marks there, to use the social strategies as part of avoidance, e.g. distracting, giving excuses. So this is how it's reframed to kind of remove the kind of aspect which is meant to which indicates that PDA is not autism. I have issues with this rephrasing because if something is strategic, it's still deliberately done because it's done as part of a strategy. So it's a bit of it's just more nonsense. So the axiom that PDA profile opponents. So there's an axiom within the PDA profile of autism discourse that PDA profile of autism proponents' views on PDA are the only valid outlook, and that people like myself are mistaken. So I've looked to been contacted by people going, well, we're getting claims by those people with PDA who are saying that your work is not valid, not representative of the experience of the bits and pieces. And so I'm having to argue back, going, actually, no, my work is valid, and give examples and everything else. And it's just, And it kind of goes back to this point that in order to kind of claim that your views are the only ones valid, you have to ignore other topic experts' views. And this goes back to the point around observed in the Kidal et al. 2021 systematic review that generally alternative explanations are not accounted for. Why would you account for other people's views if you think they're mistaken? If you assume that you're right, you wouldn't account for other people's for alternative explanations. You would not account for the possibility that non-autism features are being confused with autism by assuming PDA is autism. So, yeah, if we move on to the kind of type in autism and the DSM-5 literature, it gets a bit more problematic because we know that all attempts to divide autism have failed, and it's kind of why profound autism has been constructed to occurring intellectual disability and/or language impairment. So, yeah, what this means is that the fact that PDA Profile of Autism advocates are claiming to be seeing differences between autism and PDA, it means that the PDA is not autism, is a pretty blunt answer to it. We know that the DSM-5 replaced the 3 accepted autism subtypes of Asperger's syndrome, autistic disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder, not in the way specified, with social applicational disorder and autism. I also know from talking to someone who was on the committee that created the DSM-5 autism criteria that PDA was informally considered to be included in the DSM-5 and that it was excluded from the DSM-5. So it's also worth pointing out that the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, lobbied for the autism subtypes to be removed from the DSM-5 because most autistic people do not want autism to be divided into subgroups. It's also worth noting that social application disorder is not used much, or seems not to be. So when you get to the autism DSM-5 criteria, it's not designed to create autism subtypes or to diagnose subtypes. It's not even designed to identify PDA profile of autism. So what that means is each time someone's claiming to be using DSM-5 to diagnose PDA profile of autism, they're misusing the DSM-5 autism criteria. We get into the final section before the conclusion. So I've noticed recently several fallacies within the kind of PDA profile of autism kind of discourse. I can provide concrete examples of this, like within the literature. It's just that this talk, when I gave it, is less informal, so I didn't need to be as rigorous as I technically normally would do. So, for example, there's begging the question. So it seems that PDA is a distinct thing and are going to prove it as a thing. There's also kind of the no true Scotsman fallacy, which has been, I think, also noted of profound autism. It's like if descriptions, diagnoses do not conform to PDA profile of autism, they are not PDA, such as instead are rational demand avoidance. So the third one is appeal to popularity. So claiming that many hundreds, if not thousands, of people believe in PDA profile of autism, so PDA must be a thing. There's also kind of the equivalence fallacy. So claiming that PDA profile of autism is different and distinct thing, with its features being different to autism, but PDA profile of autism is a profile of autism. And this is just well, I just think it's nonsense, and it goes back to the point I made earlier about A plus B plus C does not equal A is applicable. PDA cannot be the same thing if it's just at the same time different from it. That's just basic logic. So yeah, this is an example which I kind of often refer to. So 2-3 months ago, there was like a PDA conference by PDA Profile of Autism advocates, and there's a talk by Riko Ryuki called PDA versus ADA. So the difference between PDA and autistic demand-avoidance and why it matters. If you're telling me that PDA's demand-avoidance is different to autistic demand-avoidance, you're literally telling me that PDA's demand-avoidance, which is its central feature, by the way, of PDA, is different from the demand-avoidance seen in autism. So what that means is you're literally telling me and other people that PDA is not autism. I'd also point out that demand-avoidance is not a core component of autism. Or in how it's identified. It's not even in, like, even if, say for example, that aversion monotropism questionnaire becomes an autism assessment tool, demand avoidance will not be a central aspect of monotropism. So yeah, they're getting on to the last two kind of fallacies that seem to be applicable. So there's a false dichotomy. So there's a dichotomy of kind of PDA profile of ASD is being kind of complex or perplexing versus kind of non-profile of ASD kind of non-PDA profile of ASD autism. So which is kind of is meant to be kind of more straightforward or kind of classic. And this goes back to that quote from Ruth Fidder, which I mentioned earlier. There's also kind of a Texas sharpshooter fallacy, which is kind of assuming that PDA is a profile of autism and then conducting research to support it. So it's assuming that PDA features equal autism features. It's only investigating PDA in entirely suspected autistic population samples. It's designing tools which assume PDA is a version of autism. It's recruiting participants from sources which are kind of knowledgeable in PDA profile of autism. And so I'm just going to conclude now before kind of getting onto the references briefly. So yes, it's reasonable to consider if accounts of PDA profile of autism are confusingly reattributing non-autism features with autism. It's plausible, perhaps probable, that PDA represents non-autism features. This possibly should already be actively considered. I shouldn't need to do this talk. It should be kind of prominent front and center within the kind of PDA discourse. Responsibility for potential harm from premature verification on PDA profile of autism is from those advocating for PDA of autism, basically. People claiming that PDA is a profile of autism should be taken responsibility for what they're claiming about it and be much more cautious. And that's just basically just following typical research standards and typical ethical standards. We should also be prioritising the integrity of autism and sector categories over PDA profile of autism. And this kind of matters because, as I kind of showed earlier, a bunch of PDA features are not indicative of autism. So you can't assume that a person is autistic due to someone being attributed with PDA. So it also means that you risk undermining the integrity of autism diagnoses and autism research by having these non-autism features being lumped in with autism. It's not good. It's not a good look, personally. So I'm just going to conclude. So these are my contact details. So that's my email address, my Twitter handle. My ResearchGate has we'll have a copy of these slides when it's published, which will probably be tomorrow. By tomorrow, I mean the 5th of August, 2023. And this is my YouTube channel, which you're probably watching this video on. And I always have any questions being asked. So there are 6 slides with references on. I'm not going to linger on them for long because you can pause the video to access them if you want to. So this is the first slide, reference slide. This is the second one. So I hope you've found this talk useful and interesting. I hope you kind of take it away, and I hope that it kind of some people take notice of it and act on it in a productive way. So yeah, that's the final slide. So I'll thank you for watching me talk about PDA again, and hopefully you come back next time. So thank you. Bye.